Welcome to the 5th lesson of our EDU Onyx series on learning Python. Today we will discuss the basics of variables and data types. Now that we've looked at some basic operations with Python code and written a simple program, let's look at some critically important data structures so we can continue handling data and writing programs. The basis of programming in nearly any programming language is the usage of variables. A variable is simply a container that can hold information for later use in your program. In Python, we name a variable a keyword and then assign it a value so that we can access that value anywhere later in our program. If you want to access data at all in Python, you will need to use some kind of variables in order to store that data and perform operations with it in your Python program. For example, if you are writing a program that performs some kind of calculations concerning a number of objects, you would most likely need to use a variable to store the information about the amount of objects you have, as opposed to having to re-enter that number every time you need access to that information. You could call that variable num_objects and assign it the value you need for your calculations. Let's look at an example in Python. Let's open up the Python interactive interpreter so that we can get a quick look at how variables work in the Python programming language. Let's declare the number of objects variable we were talking about earlier in this lesson. First, to declare a variable in Python, you type the variable name keyword, and then assign it a value by adding the equal sign and a number. Now that variable carries the value 15. If we type the variable name into our Python interactive interpreter, it returns the value 15 to us, letting us know that the variable num_objects has the value 15 right now. In Python, while you can name your variable nearly anything, there are a few specific rules concerning what characters you are allowed to have in your variable name. Variable names cannot contain spaces, start with a number, or be any of the Python language keywords so as not to confuse what object you are referring to. Python language keywords will be highlighted in nearly any available Python editor, so they can be easily identified. Also, variable names in Python cannot contain any special character with the exception of the underscore character. In this slide, you can see some examples of both good and bad variable names. When using the Python interactive interpreter or any Python editor, when you type in a Python language keyword, let's say, for example, we use the print function like we talked about earlier when starting Python. It is highlighted yellow so that you know it is a Python language keyword and cannot be used as a variable name. The first and most basic type of data available to us in Python is the integer. Like in mathematics, an integer can be any positive or negative whole number that doesn't contain any decimal information. The first and most basic type of data available to us in Python is the integer. Like in mathematics, an integer can be any positive or negative whole number that doesn't contain any decimal information. In Python, the integer data type is commonly abbreviated as int. We can use the type function in Python to see what type of data a specific variable is. Let's create another basic integer variable and then look at what type it is by using the type function. So first, let's create our variable. In this instance, let's call it velocity and assign it a basic value. And then let's use the type function by typing the word type and an open parentheses and then typing the name of our variable. It tells us that the type of our variable is int, or integer, in the Python programming language. For dealing with decimal numbers, Python has another data type known as the floating point number, or float, in Python. Variables that contain decimal information in Python are assigned to the floating point data type. Let's look at that velocity variable we created last time again, but this time let's pass it some decimal information. And now let's call the type function one more time on our velocity variable to see what kind of output it gives us. It lets us know that the velocity variable is of type float, or a floating point number, and that it contains decimal information as a result of this. One last and very important data type we will be working with today in Python is the string. Any kind of text data in Python is stored as a data type known as string. A string can be any length of text and can contain any set of characters or numbers. Strings are denoted by a set of quotes in Python. This is why it was important for us to put our text between quotes in our first program, since we wanted to make sure Python dealt with it as text and not as some kind of numerical value or variable. Let's create one more variable and use the type function to see what kind of type Python has defined it as. Let's create our variable phrase and pass it some text between quotes. Now when we use our type function, Python will let us know that the variable phrase has the data type string. With the various data types that we've just looked at in Python, there are a number of simple operations we can perform on variables. This is where it will become very important to know the data type of the variables we are working with. Let's open a new window with our Python editor and look at an example of how data types can become very important to us when performing data operations. So first, let's create two variables, number 1 and number 2. While these are numbers, I've declared them as a string. This will present to us one of the very important reasons for data typing in Python. Because when I add these two numbers, although we would like them to add the values of the numbers together, Python deals with strings very differently than it does integers or floating point numbers. Let's have it print out the value of number 1 plus number 2. Let's save and then run our Python script and see what happens. It prints out 12 instead of 3 as you might have expected, because when Python works with strings, the add operator simply puts the two strings together instead of actually adding the values of the numbers. Since Python doesn't know we're dealing with numerical values, it has dealt with our addition as strings. Let's look at a similar example, but this time, let's make sure Python operates on our data in the correct way. So once again, let's declare two variables, number 1 and number 2. But this time, let's assign their values to be integers and not strings, and see what Python does. And once again, let's use the print function to print out the value of this addition. And then let's save and run our simple Python program and see what happens. Python prints out the correct number this time because it knows that it's dealing with integer values instead of strings. To get a quick overview of all the concepts we've looked at so far, let's write a simple program that performs some simple calculations concerning time. So first, let's declare a variable called minutes and assign it the value 60. In order to make your code clearer to read, you can add comments. Then let's declare a variable called hours and assign it the value 24. Then let's use one more variable entitled days and assign it the value 7. From here, we can perform some simple data operations to find out the amount of minutes per day and the amount of hours per week, and have that printed out to the user for this simple program. So first, let's create a print statement, and then perform the calculation that would tell us the amount of minutes per day, which is simply minutes times hours. We use the asterisk symbol in order to denote multiplication in the Python programming language. And then let's print some text to let us know the value we're printing out. Let's have this program perform one more simple calculation, the amount of hours per week, by multiplying hours times days and having that value printed out. Then we can save our program and run it to see the simple calculations that have been performed. That wraps up the basics of variables and data types and data operations in the Python programming language. In the next lesson, we'll talk about getting input from your user and using that to enhance your programs.